In 1961, the Soviet Union made history when it launched the first man into space. This was a crucial milestone in the Cold War battle that was the space race. Now, of course, this was no friendly competition. This was a war fought between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, fought not with arms, but with minds. Really, the space race was part of the propaganda war that made up the Cold War. Okay, yes, it was, but I also didn't do a good job explaining that. Yes, the space race was important because of propaganda. Space was just like cool. And so it made you look good to be doing stuff in space. However, it was also a show of military might. You know, this is the same time that the US and the Soviet Union are developing missiles, and especially intercontinental ballistic missiles. So your ability to do stuff in space had a direct correlation with your military power and what your technology could do in the event that the Cold War went hot. Okay, back to the thing. Propaganda often involves stretching the truth or outright lying, and space was no exception. There's virtually no debate over whether Gagarin went to space. He did. He went to space. There is debate, though, about whether or not he was actually first. Some conspiracy theorists believe that the Soviet Union had sent previous manned missions to space, but that they had covered them up because they resulted in the deaths of the cosmonauts involved. Now, an exhaustive list of these would be just kind of like long and boring, and it would kind of suck. So what we're going to do instead is I'm going to focus on one mission and the theories surrounding that one mission. That mission was known as Coverup Sputnik 1. Coverup Sputnik 1 launched on May 15th, 1960. TASS, one of the Soviet state-owned media organizations, announced that the mission contained all of the necessities for a future manned spaceflight, including a human dummy. This seems to have been accepted in the immediate aftermath of the launch. Before long, though, some people started claiming that the spaceman inside was no mannequin, but that it might have been an actual person. Before talking about their claims relating to Sputnik 4, I need to give some backstory on Achille and Giovanni Giudica Cordelia. They were two Italian brothers from Turin who were interested in radio as young men. When Sputnik launched, they decided to try to intercept the beeping that it was transmitting. And this sparked a long-standing interest in listening to both Soviet and American satellites and their radio transmissions. They built this like whole big listening station even in Turin. Now, they claimed to eventually intercept transmissions from Yuri Gagarin's and John Glenn's flights, some of the earliest flights with people in orbit. But what they also claim to have captured in the interim between Sputnik 1 and Vostok 1 are some much more concerning transmissions that connect back to Coverup Sputnik. The supposed recording that allegedly came from Coverup Sputnik 1 was captured by the Cordelia brothers in May of 1960, shortly after the probe's launch. Now, there was some uncertainty in that last sentence, and that's because I cannot verify that this recording ever existed. Instead, most people focus on a later recording from November of 1960, which contains a SOS coming from an unknown Soviet probe. Now our craft, Coverup Sputnik, was in orbit at the time. It was the only Soviet craft in orbit at the time. However, it couldn't have been the source of the signal because the signal did not come from a ship in orbit. The Cordelia brothers claim that it came from a ship moving directly away from Earth, stationary in the sky with no Doppler effect. that there's no such craft that we know of. So we have to assume that if any signals came from Korabl Sputnik, it was only those in the May recording, which is lost to history if it ever existed. All that exists is the same endlessly repeated description of it. The description says that it contained a crew of cosmonauts saying that their craft was going off course. Now, interestingly, whether or not this is a real recording, and I don't think it is, that it's not wrong about what happened to Korabl Sputnik. It wasn't originally supposed to remain in orbit months after its May 15th launch date. There was a mistake. The Korabl Sputnik probe was only intended to remain in orbit for 4 days. After that point, a re-entry module separated from its service module and was going to fire some boosters to slow it down and re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. That did happen. The boosters fired successfully. They just fired in the wrong direction, pushing the probe into a higher orbit where it would remain for years. This mistake that left the craft in orbit for much longer than originally intended is central to another conspiracy theory regarding a potential human passenger of Sputnik 4. In October of 1960, an essay titled "Pravda Means Truth" was published in the American Mercury. It was written by science fiction author Robert Heinlein, and it covered the dissonance between the Soviet newspaper's name, Pravda does indeed translate to truth, and its contents. As a state-owned media outlet in the Soviet Union, Pravda was often unable to live up to its name in what it published. It published propaganda instead. That's what media did in the Soviet Union. And to demonstrate this, Heinlein tells a story about his experience on May 15th, 1960. Heinlein was in Vilnius at the time, the capital of modern-day Lithuania, then part of the Soviet Union. While there, he encountered a group of Soviet Army cadets who were excited to tell him about what the Soviet Union had accomplished that day. The Soviet Union had launched a man into space, they told him. A Soviet cosmonaut was orbiting the Earth as they spoke. Heinlein was distressed by this. He thought that the Soviet Union had beaten the Americans to yet another space milestone. So he tried to verify it. He tried to find a copy of Pravda that evening and was unable to. He tried to listen to the Voice of America, an American state-owned media outlet, kind of American propaganda. It was jammed. Jammed, he says, more heavily than it had ever been jammed before. Additionally, later that day, his Soviet guide would correct the story he had been told by the Red Army cadets. It was just a dummy on the craft, he was told. The cadets had misunderstood. Heinlein would tell much the same story at the World Science Fiction Convention the next year. His point was this: propaganda damages our ability to know the truth. There was no way for Heinlein to know whether or not the probe that was still orbiting the Earth contained a dummy or a dead body. Perhaps, he argued, the Soviets realized that something was wrong in the hours after launch on May 15th and changed the story before the failed deorbit a few days later. By this time, that was well known. People knew that the mission had gone awry and that the craft was still in orbit. Now today, I can be pretty sure that there was no person aboard Sputnik 4. After Heinlein's theory was published, the craft continued to orbit the Earth. It would eventually come down about 2 years later, on September 6th, 1962. This provides the greatest proof that we have that no person was aboard Korabl Sputnik. It had no heat shield. It had nothing to protect it against the harsh conditions of re-entry. It would have been a suicide mission. the largest piece of Sputnik 4 crashed in Manitowoc, Wisconsin, digging a hole 3 inches deep in the pavement. And that is where I am. I am in Manitowoc right now. I wanted to film at least this paragraph next to the crash site, but apparently they are doing construction on the building right next to it, so there was construction noise. Anyway, it's about a quarter mile like that way. That's where the satellite crashed. There is still no evidence that any unknown cosmonauts were launched into orbit, even today, decades after the fall of the Soviet Union and the release of many classified Soviet-era documents. That doesn't mean that the conspiracy theorists were entirely wrong, though. As with many conspiracy theories, there was a grain of truth in there somewhere. There was at least one member of the Soviet space program who died and whose death was covered up. His name was Valentin Bondienko, and his disappearance even helped spawn the conspiracy theory. He appeared in some, but not all, versions of a photograph featuring the original cosmonaut trainees. Contrary to the grandiose imaginings of the conspiracy theorists, though, Bondienko's death did not take place in space, but here on the ground. A few weeks before Gagarin's flight, Bondienko was undergoing a training exercise in a pressurized chamber. He'd been in the chamber for 10 days when he made a mistake that would prove fatal. He was removing medical sensors from his body and cleaning the area where they had been with a cotton cloth. Without looking, he discarded the cloth, and it landed on an electric hot plate, which set it ablaze. In the oxygen-rich atmosphere of the chamber, the blaze spread uncontrollably, and Bondienko was engulfed in flames. It would take minutes before the pressure could be released and Bondienko could be removed from the chamber. He died hours later from the burns. The Soviets covered this up, fearing embarrassment. However, if they hadn't done so, if they'd told the world about the tragedy of Bondienko's death, they could have saved the lives of 3 men years later. Bondienko's story might sound familiar to people who are familiar with American space history. In 1967, NASA was performing a rehearsal of a mission designated AS-204. The mission was testing what would eventually become the Apollo command and service modules. While undergoing that rehearsal, a fire broke out in the pure oxygen atmosphere of the craft. Again, the flames spread uncontrollably, and all 3 astronauts on board perished. In their honor, NASA later officially redesignated the mission Apollo 1. There is no doubt in my mind that had the Soviet Union refrained from covering up Bondienko's death and told the world about the dangers of atmospheres with high concentrations of oxygen, the Apollo 1 astronauts would have survived. Just this one instance of Soviet propaganda led to the preventable deaths of 3 men. Robert Heinlein was wrong about the contents of Coverup Sputnik 1, but he was right about something else. When Pravda, propaganda, is presented as truth, nobody knows what to believe. Things you are told are dangerous might be safe, and dangerous things might be hidden altogether. Speculation abounds, conspiracy theories grow. The fact that there are people who continue to believe that there are lost cosmonauts whose deaths in space were covered up is only further evidence of this. And the crash site of Sputnik 4 here in Manitowoc, Wisconsin is the closest thing we have to a monument for the lost cosmonauts who probably never existed.